Hi, everybody. Please take a seat, Kevin.
So
I'm guessing that everybody who's left the room are fully GDPR compliant, have no issues whatsoever. Okay, so before Kevin and I start our chat, I'd just like to position where we see we are right now with GDPR compliance. So, oh, and I have clicker problems too. Crikey, it seems to be endemic among the Ovum team. Could somebody move this slide forward for me, please? Thank you. Okay, so at Ovum, we annually conduct a survey with enterprise organisations. Around 5,000 people are surveyed in this annual ICT Enterprise Insights. And we can see here on the left-hand side of this slide that enterprises have classed the management of security, identity and privacy as their number 2 priority when it comes to trends, IT trends. But then number 1 is the creation of digital capability. And in my opinion, you can't have one without the other. You cannot create digital capabilities without actually thinking about security, identity and privacy. Okay, so I think with GDPR, we've seen organisations approach them in a number of ways. So the first one is to ignore it and let's hope it goes away. Now, last year I was volunteering at a local race, a half marathon near where I live, which isn't in London, as you can probably tell from my accent. And in this race, we had recently introduced chip timing. And so I said to the guy who'd organised it all, okay, so how are you approaching GDPR in your organisation? And they take name, they take mobile phone number, and things like that to be able to provide them with their timing for the half marathon. And he went, what? And he hadn't heard of GDPR. Now, that was in June last year. I'm pretty sure he'd heard of it by the time May came around this year. But I certainly think that that's fairly typical in some of the very small organisations that actually ignored it or weren't even aware of it, actually. But then there's a lot of other organisations who were absolutely aware of it and decided that they would operate a tick box approach because they felt the need to go through the regulation, either with help or themselves, and make sure that they were ticking all the boxes when it comes to compliance. And then last but by no means least are those organisations who actually already had a data privacy programme in place, and then they checked against the GDPR and made the adjustments that they needed to do. So, in my opinion, I'm actually a fan of GDPR. I know that won't go down well with everybody, but I do actually think that it's been a really good thing, because for those organisations that were perhaps a little bit lax about data privacy, it's given them a wake-up call, and for lots of other organisations that have actually got data privacy programmes in place, then it wasn't such a huge issue for them. Okay, so how has GDPR compliance moved on? This was a survey done by IBM immediately prior to the 25th of May, so in the 3 months prior to it. We can see here that kind of roughly half of organisations, roughly half of organisations had actually begun compliance efforts. That's pretty good. Around a fifth hadn't even started to put anything in place, and around a third expected to be compliant by the deadline date. We can pick up any number of statistics about what's going on today. These are just some examples. So we still have nearly a third that are not compliant, 37% are still ignoring it, and these are from a number of sources, of course. 11.7% are actually taking a wait-and-see approach. So I wonder if that's changed. Let's think about this morning. What was on the news this morning? The Equifax data breach from last year. Equifax is being fined £500,000 by the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, for that breach in 2017. It was very interesting that obviously that's pre-GDPR. A lot of people are still waiting to hear about what happens with breaches post 25th of May. But then quite interesting as well, and particularly applicable to this discussion where we're talking about moving on from GDPR compliance to actually a global data privacy programme. We see that around half of organisations that have got a data privacy programme they have a scalable data privacy program. So although 1/5 of organizations don't have a scalable data privacy program, they've simply focused on complying with GDPR, actually half of organizations believe that they can do a bit more with their data privacy. So, Kevin. Rather a long introduction, sorry for that, everybody. But certainly, I think where we see the significant minority, 1/5 of organisations that haven't gone for they've just gone for GDPR compliance, is that something that resonates with the organisations that you've seen at OneTrust, the ones that you're working with?
Yeah, it immediately reminds me of the Mark Twain quote, lies, damn lies, and statistics. And I think this, we see some very aspirational numbers probably here. We do get a unique perspective. OneTrust today supports over 1,500 large customers around the world in various stages of their own privacy programs. But these are the ones that have made a decision to actually put purse and mandate behind developing a privacy program and perhaps bringing in tooling like ours. So I get a very narrow view of it from that perspective of who is really doing it. We do see and talk to a lot of organizations perhaps that aren't doing anything. And again, I would say that there's a range of answers out there, certainly a spectrum of positions. Most companies are still really getting their hands around this, and it's still sort of the early stages of where privacy is going as a discipline for most enterprises.
So is that kind of regional? Is that vertical? Are there any kind of nuances there that you've seen?
I'd say there are a few verticals that maybe are feeling a little more exposure to GDPR in particular. It doesn't seem to be something that is as geographical as you might expect. The GDPR is a European law, and you might think it'd be easy to expect that European companies would be the only ones really concerned with it. If any of you are familiar or have read the law, and most of you I'm sure have some exposure, you know that it's extraterritorial in the way that the law has been constructed. If you're processing data on an EU citizen, you could be very much in scope for the law. And there are other mechanisms that could put you in scope for it. So we actually see a lot of companies around the world, maybe even more so outside of Europe, at least early on, were some of the first to really get behind this in a big way. And I think the reason for it, in my opinion here, would be that a lot of them felt like they would be the first to get scrutiny, particularly some of the American companies. US companies have historically not been maybe as careful as they should be. I think that's fair to say, and we can talk about Equifax today as an example. But there's also a number of very well-known consumer businesses that are built on mining your information and selling your information. Google, Facebook as prime examples of that. So there is a well-deserved reputation that American companies are a little bit cavalier with privacy. And for that reason, I think we saw a lot of American companies getting on board early. They expected the scrutiny, that they would be the first to get prosecuted under the GDPR, and they really wanted to make sure that they were getting their house in order. Closely related to that statement, I would also say that technology as a vertical is one that has probably been a little more aggressive about trying to get something in order, just because, again, the nature of their products and services mean that they don't necessarily stop at the border. It's very hard to control these things. They have to build it out in a way that reflects, sort of the lowest common denominator, if you will, of privacy laws around the world.
Okay, so they've kind of been leading the way almost, would you say, these organizations?
In our experience, they've been probably the most aggressive about putting programs together and really trying to get it right. There are others that I would point to that are close followers. CPG, consumer packaged goods, have also, they do a lot of advertising. They want to have a very close relationship with their consumers and obviously B2C companies. So they've been pretty aggressive about going forward with it. It's not something that is targeted at any one sector, so everybody has exposure, and I wouldn't say that any one industry is really ignoring it, but those two are probably moving the fastest.
Okay, and so how have organisations in the other sectors, in those other industries, cope with complying with GDPR?
Yeah, there is some of the head in the sand, let's ignore this as long as we can and try to pretend like we didn't know or we didn't understand. Even when faced with indisputable sort of analysis that they do have it, there is a lot of let's deflect and minimize, and you know, there are certain companies right now you could go on and try to hit their website, and you're going to see that they're just trying to say, well, we're not going to serve European consumers. We're going to shut that down. So a number of different sort of ways to try to deflect and limit exposure, I'll say, to the law.
Okay. And so to many organisations, I think compliance, as I showed in the previous slide, has been a bit of a tick box exercise. Is that what it means to a lot of organisations? Do they think, oh crikey, 25th of May, make sure I've sent all those emails, I've ticked all those boxes, that's done, move on to the 26th of May and something else? Or have they taken it more as a kind of program and approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a year ago, that was a very common conversation. I know one we would have a lot. Many organizations, and maybe some of you in the room felt this way as well, that look, this is going to be a massive effort, and it's just one of those Y2K things that we've got to go and you know, full house fire drill, try to get things put in order as they relate to the law, and then we can move on and really get back to doing business and whatever it is that we do. Most organizations, as they got into it, realized that, look, the GDPR is definitely not just a compliance exercise. This is a ongoing compliance requirement that is really going to have operational impact and has had massive impact for most companies in the way that they process data and the way that they conduct their business.
Yeah, it's not, compliance cannot be fire and forget. It's a program.
Absolutely. And you know, if anything, I think we've seen GDPR was the most prominent early sort of regulation that came out this way, and certainly went well beyond anything else that had been put on the books elsewhere around the world. But since that time, we've seen other countries, whether they're trying to pursue adequacy to make sure that their laws are compliant and therefore that they can continue to enjoy free data flow and all the trade benefits of being compliant, or just that privacy itself is becoming a much more topical, well understood, and sort of a populist theme almost with a lot of countries. Most recently, California passed their own law, the Ccpa, California Consumer Privacy Act. California is the 6th largest economy in the world. Even for those companies that felt like maybe they didn't have a lot of exposure to the GDPR, they now know they have to do something because they probably do some business in California. In many ways, that law will go further than the GDPR, and there's other ways that it's not as rigorous. We'll see what the final law emerges as. There's a lot of lobbying going on right now in Sacramento about this. But it's yet another example of where things are going, and there have been many others around the world. So it's just part of a longer-term trend.
So that presents an interesting point, though, because if you think about the CCPA, which I don't know in depth at all, GDPR I know a little bit more about, but do they match perfectly? Is one more comprehensive than the other? And then I'm sure it must be the same for other privacy legislation around the globe. Does it differ in, I don't know, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, maybe not the best example, but you know, the different levels of privacy legislation that need to be dealt with? Indeed.
I would say that the GDPR is perhaps the most comprehensive still, although we'll see if others catch up to this, and it looks like some may. California's law is unique in that it very broadly defines what would be in scope in terms of personal data, and you see an expansion perhaps of what could be part of the charter for the law. But in other areas it's silent, or it doesn't include as much coverage of some of the individual rights and the obligations that companies have and the way that the regulators will have to address some of these points. So GDPR is still the most robust in that sense. Again, I think that there's a lot of evolution that will continue to happen on this point, and we'll see how it unfolds.
Yeah, okay. Do you think organisations are scared, perhaps, about, maybe in the UK, about the ICO, but whoever you've to report a breach to? So obviously we've heard about the Equifax thing this morning, but that was pre-GDPR. Yep. We've got a couple of high-profile cases since the 25th of May, Ticketmaster, BA, for example. Yep. And then also, of course, this thing that came up in my LinkedIn feed that I hadn't realised, which is the kind of PPI type organisation that's grown up from the BA breach. It was using that as an example to say, oh, have you been affected by the BA breach? Ring us and we'll sort you out kind of thing. So are organizations scared of that sort of thing?
Yeah, I would say so. And again, we've probably got some good stories across this room, and many organizations that are taking it very seriously because there's a palpable sense of the risk of not being compliant with the law. I think there's also a bigger issue here that many organizations are waking up to, that privacy or the trust of your organization, being a good steward of personal data, is part of your brand reputation. And setting aside all these regulations that seem to be springing up around the world, organizations understand that, and they want to act with integrity and show that they're not spying on you or doing things that you as a consumer might be uncomfortable with. So that's a very positive trend, and one I would point to along those lines.
Yeah, sure. So kind of GDPR has almost leveled the playing field for those organizations that were using that, our data privacy as a differentiator.
Look at the examples that you've just mentioned. So, it was about a year ago that we first heard about Equifax. September 7th, I think, is when they finally came out public with it. They had known about it since the end of June. And not only had they been, thinking about it, talking about it, working with their PR people, trying to understand how bad this is and get their stories straight, you saw all sorts of other things that are really embarrassing now. The executives were selling their stock shares, and there's more, I think, that will unfold out of this story. Contrast that with the other example you mentioned. We all heard about BA a couple weeks ago. BA, whatever we learn about the situation and the way it happened, they've released some information. You have to compliment how quickly they came forward with it. And they were really, really transparent and sharing what they knew and getting it out as quickly as they could. And they've continued to sort of be in front of this as much as possible. So I think that's the first example that we can look to of a company really trying to behave the way that you would want them to under the GDPR. And they have to know they're a big target. Forget about Brexit and whether there's going to be, a little more pressure for them to show that they're taking this European law seriously. They're a big consumer brand. This would be an obvious target to make an example for prosecution out of. So they seem to be really handling the responsibility well, at least in my opinion. Again, we'll see what else comes of it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that we've seen examples of the response being very poor and Friday afternoon very bad news kind of thing. But BA has been the exact opposite of that. So that's good. So if we think about GDPR compliance, how can that help an organisation that realises it needs to deal with other privacy regulations around the globe? How can they move from purely being compliant with GDPR to moving towards a global data privacy program, or even a bigger regional data privacy program? Yeah,
well, the point about looking at how these different laws align and trying to identify sort of where those universal sort of control points are that every organization should have, because they're probably pretty consistent from one law to the next. And it's even more than just some of the privacy standards. You can look at parallels with ISO 27001, the security standard, that there are certain operational aspects to that really are aligned with what the GDPR asks of you. Obviously, there's additional responsibilities there, but it's a great starting point. And this is a real problem, even here within Europe. The GDPR was intended to harmonize the laws relating to privacy across the 29 member states of Europe. And for the most part, they were pretty successful in doing that, but you will still see that there's some important derogations from one place to the next around issues like consent and what it means to take consent that's lawful, that's valid from an individual, and then market to them or process their data. Some countries requiring explicit consent, others only in certain situations. You could also say the same with data breach, and that some of the requirements of how a company has to respond and what they have to do with the knowledge they have are a little bit different from one member state to the next in certain areas. Belgium, as an example, is different from Germany in some small ways. So understanding that nuance, it's complicated even here in Europe. Now, as you go globally, it really becomes a bigger issue. I'm originally from the United States. We still don't have a privacy law. Obviously, California is working on one. In the US, you have 50 states with 50 different breach requirements. And the 50th state just passed a law this year, I'm embarrassed to say. So very slow at putting some laws on the books around this. And of course, it's even more complicated when you start looking around the world. Brazil has just passed their version of what you could say is a GDPR. Australia passed something last year. Knowing that and how to navigate it becomes incredibly complex and could be difficult. I think the best approach, to get back to your original question, is again trying to have a strong, robust program. If you get those proper control points in and you're thinking about privacy by design and really trying to build this into sort of a reflex of the organization and make it one of those core concerns, you're going to go a long way towards satisfying most of the legal requirements. The ones that you won't catch are going to be very specific around, how quickly do you have to disclose a breach, perhaps. In the EU, it's now 72 hours from the time that you become aware of it. Other countries, it may be as much as 30 days or as little as 24 hours. So there is still some variance. You'll need to know that. And that, as an organization, most companies here probably have some sort of breach response plan in place. If you know the jurisdictions that you're working in and you can quickly say, we believe the breach happened in this area or that it affected consumers in this area, all of that can be somewhat template driven. So again, having a strong program as the bedrock of this and then being able to extend to those certain markets and the nuances of the local areas that you're doing business in.
So do you normally work with compliance functions then in the, with the privacy programs that you put in place?
Yeah, in our case, our tooling, which supports a lot of these privacy programs and automates some of the reporting and governance around it, initially we would be brought in, usually by outside counsel, a big law firm, perhaps one of the big four consultancies, that was engaged to help an organization with their privacy program and getting a readiness effort in place for GDPR. So that conversation would have started with probably the legal team or maybe somebody in compliance. Increasingly, we're seeing this shift over to being a function of security, that they see it as sort of the other side of the coin from security. Security, of course, looking at the needs of the organization and how do we protect those interests. At the same time, you can probably address many of those same concerns for the individual with a robust privacy program that is tightly integrated. Okay,
it's quite interesting that you say it's part of security, because I would always take it out of security from a compliance perspective. I think compliance is a huge lever on security, but actually the technology is one thing, and the kind of overall approach to security.
No, I always say they're sort of two different approaches to the same endpoint. They're both trying to protect the data.
And I was having a conversation with somebody just the other day from one of the big four, and we were talking about where the CISO sits. Does the CISO report to the CIO, to the board, to wherever? And their view was that they would sit between the CRO, the Chief Risk Officer, and the CIO, because then you're not focused purely on the tech side of things, but you've got influence from risk, and then of course compliance would come nicely into that too. So what are the elements of a global data privacy program? Are there, is there just kind of a few bits you need to consider? How would it all fit together? Because I can't imagine it's an easy ask for many.
Yeah, again, I think regardless of which law you're looking at, the first thing that you need to do is just get a good inventory of your processing activities in place. Understanding what data is being collected and knowing some of the basics around it. And again, this is a core requirement of the GDPR. So if you look to the actual text of the law, you'll find Article 30 really lays out some of those core responsibilities as an organization. I have to know what data I'm processing for what purpose, where is it going, and do we have cross-border data flows that are happening? What is the legal basis that I have that I can justify for using that? These are things, again, that are going to be pretty consistent with most of the major legal frameworks around the world, but they're also just good things in terms of internal discipline to know what it is we're doing. Why do we have this data? Should we be keeping it? Do we need to retain it for X number of years? Or does that pose an unnecessary risk? So once you start getting a basic picture of what's out there, I think it's a great step towards compliance with probably most of the laws, and B, just best practice for each organization to get a handle on that.
Okay. So this one is, so that one was showing the different locations where there are, for example, different rules and expectations for organisations to comply with. And then, I guess that the first thing that we would think about, as you've just said, is the region, the regulations that you need to comply with, and then building it out from there.
That's right. And I really like this graphic that you guys put together that sort of shows what that trajectory looks like for a lot of companies. For most, it started with sort of a policy, and that's really is all it was. That we have a privacy policy, and this is what we say we do, but nobody really gave it much more thought in most cases. It was written by the attorneys and read by very few people, especially within the organization. To then getting that paper compliance out and starting to do some of the basics. So again, doing some assessments around what's being collected and why, and that's what you see here with readiness efforts, privacy impact assessments, data protection, data inventory, again, all of those Article 30 responsibilities that I mentioned, to then really operationalizing it into something that is truly ongoing compliance. Again, what are the technologies and methodologies that we can employ to make sure that we're embracing the law and running the organization in a way that is compliant. And then lastly, getting to that data experience here where, again, privacy is really built in and woven into the way that the organization works. The on-brand privacy experiences is noticed here, the communication that is really clear and intelligible about what's being collected and why it's being done. These sort of privacy interactions that are very quick and efficient in getting your consumer to understand exactly what data you're processing.
Okay, and where are the kind of biggest challenges, I suppose, in these steps? Where do organizations struggle the most?
Well, you touched on one of them, which is, in many cases, your organization may not have a defined home for privacy. This isn't something that was maybe a position or a department or an office 5 years ago or even 1 year ago. A lot of organizations are still very new to this. So getting that team in place and then figuring out how they work with the other departments. It is not a siloed concern, or it certainly shouldn't be. Yeah. They've got to integrate with all the other business functions. There's got to be regular communication and understanding of what's important here and why we're doing it. Everyone needs to really be bought into that, and then having that collaboration that feeds all of it. Yeah,
not an easy challenge, I imagine, for some organizations, definitely. So if we think about GDPR and a lot of the enterprises that I've spoken with, they've gone, oh, thank heavens, the 25th of May has passed. I can now have some funding for my other projects because GDPR did actually consume a lot of time and effort and expense to get ready for compliance. Kind of irrespective of, well, not completely irrespective, but whether you've got a data privacy program already and you still needed to do something with it, or whether you were kind of just getting started with data privacy. So what sort of appetite do organizations have? The organizations that you deal with, your kind of 1,600 customer organizations, I mean, obviously they've got some appetite, but have they got the appetite to build towards a bigger program?
Yeah, it's interesting. And first, let me say there's a lot of GDPR fatigue out there. It is truly a four-letter word for most people and most organizations. We talked to a lot of companies that in the beginning felt like, well, we just need to get ready for this. We're sort of behind the ball on getting ready for GDPR. And they didn't want to do anything overly elaborate around trying to put a privacy program together pre-May 25th. They felt like they had to brace for impact and just get the basics in place to the extent that they could. And that now that they're beyond it, they want to find something that's more sustainable. And this is where maybe technology can play a role of trying to automate and make some of these collection efforts more efficient and again, just operational. That everything that was done prior to May 25th was very manual and kind of the fire drill that I mentioned of running around and let's collect this information and understand what we have and what we can do with it. Now that the need of ongoing compliance is being more understood, we do see a lot of organizations saying, well, let's invest a little more now to get savings over the next 10 years or just do this more efficiently. Yeah,
sure. Okay, good. Thank you. So if we kind of think about the elements of a data privacy program, I think, do you mind if I just
please. Yeah.
I think, again, here we go. The path, I should mention this because one of my wonderful colleagues wrote this. It's available, I think it's on your stand actually.
It is, yeah.
Kevin, on the OneTrust stand. Please do take a look at it. It's a really good view of the move from GDPR to a global data privacy program. But I just, much as I love my Chief Research Officer, it's not there. So there is a slide, and we will share it with you later, on the elements of a data privacy program. So it was beyond kind of some of the bits that we looked at before. And one of them that I feel very strongly about is awareness. That's on that slide. And you talked a bit about the silos that organisations that functions are operating in, and how can we build awareness of the importance of compliance within our organisations, because still, you know, we've all done the tick to say we understand what we need to do from a security perspective for our organisation, but yet we still see people not following the rules, not doing things that we should. I was just on the train the other morning, and a lady I'd never met before, said, "Oh, you just keep an eye on my laptop while I go get a cup of coffee," and she left it unlocked. I was just crazy. I could have pinched any kind, well, obviously I didn't, but you know, you could just take anything off that laptop that would be in breach of GDPR. So, you know, what can we do around awareness to help organisations with with this compliance?
Yeah, well, I think each organization, it's you know, something they're going to have to address. It does require strong leadership from the top to you know, really emphasize that this is important. This is something that matters. It is truly a legal issue now, and everyone has a responsibility in upholding that. You know, just as you would being compliant with any other law, you need to do this because you put the organization at risk. And then beyond that, again, that privacy is a human issue, and that, you know, this is about respect for the individual, our consumer, and having that as core to whatever your company does.
Yeah, and I think as well, I would often put myself in the shoes of my customers and think, I'm a customer of a bank, I'm a customer of a local council. And
golden rule.
Yeah, and everybody is a consumer as well as an employee. Therefore, you should treat your customers' data with the same respect as you would expect your, you know, the people that or the organisations that you're a customer of to treat your data with. So I think that's very important. Okay, I see Mr. Kirshheimer hovering in the wings, so I think we're probably done for time. So if anybody does have any further questions, please do come and see myself or Kevin after this session. We'll be around during the coffee break after Tim's session with IBM. So thank you very much, Kevin. Much appreciated. Thank you.